The blood trail led Everett Zane straight to something he never expected to find in the high country of the Colorado Rockies: a woman kneeling in the tall grass with a fawn cradled in her lap. Her sun-faded calico dress stained dark with what he hoped was animal blood and not her own. He'd been tracking an elk through the dense pine forests surrounding Florissant for the better part of the morning, his rifle balanced across his broad shoulders, when he'd noticed the smaller tracks. Mountain lion, fresh, maybe an hour old. The big cats had been getting bolder lately. This summer of 1876, bringing a drought that pushed predators closer to the scattered homesteads dotting these valleys. Everett had changed course immediately, following the tracks with the practiced ease of a man who'd spent the last 8 years living more among the peaks than among people. The scene before him told a violent story. The fawn lay trembling, its spotted coat torn along one flank where claws had raked deep. The mountain lion must have been interrupted mid-hunt, probably by this fool woman who should have known better than to interfere with nature's brutal mathematics. She looked up at his approach, and Everett found himself stopping short at the fierce determination blazing in her green eyes. "I know what you're thinking," she said, her voice steady despite the blood covering her hands. "That I should have let nature take its course. That I'm some silly woman who doesn't understand how things work out here." Everett shifted his weight, his boots crushing the summer dry grass beneath him. He was a big man, 6'3", with shoulders broadened by years of swinging axes and hauling traps through snow-laden mountains. His dark hair hung past his collar, and his beard was neatly trimmed despite his isolation. He studied the woman more carefully now. Mid-20s, he guessed, with auburn hair escaping from a practical bun and freckles scattered across her nose and cheeks. There was something in her expression that spoke of intelligence and stubbornness in equal measure. "Mountain lion that did this is probably still close," he said instead of voicing any of his other thoughts. "You armed?" She shook her head. "I left my rifle at the cabin. I was just gathering herbs along the creek when I heard the commotion." Everett scanned the tree line, his blue eyes picking out shadows and movement with the automatic wariness of someone who'd survived where others hadn't. "Where's your cabin?" "Quarter-mile east, near the big meadow." He knew the place, old Henderson's property, though he'd heard the man had died last winter. "You're Rebecca Olson," he said, placing her now, "Henderson's granddaughter." "I am." She looked back down at the fawn, her jaw set. "And I'm not leaving this animal to suffer, even if you think I'm foolish." Something about her defiance sparked an unfamiliar warmth in Everett's chest. He'd been alone for so long that human interaction had become something he merely tolerated during his quarterly trips to town for supplies. But this woman, stubborn and bleeding and fierce in her compassion, stirred something he'd thought long dead. "Didn't say you were foolish," he replied, unshouldering his rifle and propping it against a nearby boulder. He moved closer, dropping into a crouch beside her. The fawn's eyes rolled white with fear, but it was too weak to struggle. "I said the mountain lion's probably still close, which means we need to move fast. Let me see the wounds." Rebecca's expression shifted from defensive to surprised, then grateful. She adjusted her hold on the fawn, giving Everett a clearer view of the damage. His large, calloused hands moved with surprising gentleness as he examined the torn flesh. "Deep, but clean," he said after a moment. "No organs damaged far as I can tell, mostly muscle and skin torn. If we can stop the bleeding and keep infection out, it's got a chance. You'll help me?" There was something vulnerable in her question, a softness that contrasted with her earlier defiance. Everett met her gaze, and for a long moment the mountain seemed to hold its breath around them. "Yeah," he said finally, "I'll help you, but we do this at your cabin where we've got walls and supplies. Can you carry it?" I've been holding it for 20 minutes. I can manage. He almost smiled at her tart response. Then let's move. Stay close to me. I'll watch for the cat. Rebecca gathered the fawn carefully against her chest, rising with visible effort. The animal couldn't have weighed more than 30 pounds, but Everett could see her arms trembling with fatigue. He retrieved his rifle and positioned himself slightly ahead and to her left, his eyes constantly moving across the landscape. They moved through the high grass in tense silence. Everett's senses stretched taut for any sign of danger. He could hear Rebecca's breathing behind him, quick but controlled, and the soft mewling sounds of the injured fawn. The August sun beat down on them, hot despite the altitude, and sweat dampened his buckskin shirt. The cabin came into view after 10 minutes of careful progress. It was a solid structure, better than most in these parts, with proper glass windows and a stone chimney. Henderson had been a carpenter by trade before age and isolation had claimed him. Rebecca pushed ahead once they cleared the tree line, her relief obvious. "Inside," Everett commanded, his tone brooking no argument. He waited until she'd crossed the threshold before following, pulling the heavy door shut behind them and dropping the bar into place. The cabin's interior was surprisingly comfortable. Clean curtains framed the windows, and wildflowers stood in a jar on the rough-hewn table. Books lined a shelf near the stone fireplace, and Everett caught titles that surprised him: medical texts, agricultural manuals, even some poetry. This was no simple frontier woman scraping by in isolation. "Put it on the table," he said, already moving to the wash basin. "You got clean cloth, whiskey or strong spirits under the sink, and yes." Rebecca laid the fawn down carefully, one hand staying on its neck to keep it calm. "I have both. My grandfather kept medical supplies." Everett scrubbed his hands thoroughly, then began laying out what they'd need. Rebecca moved to help, and they fell into an efficient rhythm that surprised them both. She seemed to anticipate what he needed, passing him cloth and thread before he asked. "This is going to hurt it," Everett warned as he threaded a curved needle. "Probably going to thrash. I'll hold it." Rebecca positioned herself at the fawn's head, her body pressed along its spine to provide weight and warmth. "I won't let go," he believed her. There was steel in this woman, the kind that couldn't be taught or faked. Everett poured whiskey over the wounds, and the fawn bucked hard, but Rebecca held firm, murmuring soft reassurances that seemed to have no effect on the terrified animal but somehow calmed Everett's own nerves. His hands moved with steady precision as he stitched the torn flesh back together. It was delicate work, made harder by his large fingers, but he'd sewn up worse on himself over the years. Trappers learned basic doctoring or they died. Simple as that. "How did you learn this?" Rebecca asked quietly, watching him work. "Necessity. Mountains don't offer much in the way of physicians when you're bleeding out from a grizzly swipe or a knife wound from claim jumpers. You've been up here a long time. 8 years. The words came out more clipped than he'd intended. "Since '78. She didn't push, which he appreciated. Most people wanted to know why a man chose isolation, as if tragedy or darkness were the only possible explanations. Sometimes a man just preferred the company of mountains to the company of men. The stitching took the better part of an hour. By the time Everett tied off the final knot, his shoulders ached and his shirt was soaked through with sweat. The fawn had exhausted itself fighting, now lying still and panting on the table. "Now we bandage it and hope infection doesn't set in," he said, sitting back. "You got a pen or enclosure where you can keep it, the old chicken coop. I can fix it up, make it safe and comfortable." Everett nodded, studying the fawn's labored breathing. "It's going to need water soon, and eventually milk if you can get it. Goat's milk works best if you can't get deer milk, which you can't. I have a goat. Rebecca smiled, the expression transforming her face from merely pretty to genuinely beautiful. My grandfather's last goat. Ornery old thing named Turnip. This time Everett did smile, a slight quirking of his lips that felt strange after so long. Turnip. She eats everything, including my vegetable garden, hence the name. Rebecca's fingers stroked the fawn's head gently. Thank you for helping. I know you probably think I'm foolish for trying to save it. Didn't say that. You didn't have to. Most men out here would have put a bullet in it and called it mercy. Everett stood, moving to the window to scan the clearing around the cabin. No sign of the mountain lion, but that meant nothing. Mercy takes different forms. Sometimes mercy is ending suffering quick. Sometimes it's fighting to prevent it. Neither's wrong, just different choices. That's a surprisingly philosophical view for a mountain man. He glanced back at her, one eyebrow raised. Mountain men can't read philosophy. I didn't mean, she stopped, laughing softly. You're right, that was presumptuous of me. I apologize. No offense taken. He turned from the window, suddenly aware of how the afternoon light caught in her hair, turning it the color of autumn leaves. I should check your property line, make sure that cat's moved on. Will you come back? The question came out quickly, almost before she'd seemed to decide to ask it. To check on the fawn, I mean. You clearly know more about this than I do. Everett hesitated. The smart thing would be to say no, to return to his cabin another 5 miles up the mountain, and let this woman with her green eyes and stubborn compassion fade into a memory. He'd learned the hard way that caring about people only led to pain, but even as he thought it, he was nodding. I'll come back tomorrow. Bring some herbs that'll help with the healing. You make sure it drinks, even if you have to force water down its throat. I will. Rebecca stood, wiping her bloody hands on her already ruined dress. Can I at least offer you coffee before you go, or something to eat? It's nearly dinner time. His stomach chose that moment to growl, betraying him. When was the last time he'd eaten? Breakfast, some jerky and hardtack at dawn. Rebecca's smile widened at the sound. I'll take that as a yes. Sit, please. You've earned a meal. Everett found himself obeying, settling onto the sturdy bench at the table while Rebecca moved around her kitchen with practiced efficiency. She had a pot of stew hanging over the fire, likely started that morning for dinner. The smell that rose as she stirred it made his mouth water. Real vegetables, not just meat and wild onions. How long have you been here alone? He asked, watching her work. Since February, when my grandfather passed. She ladled stew into 2 wooden bowls. He'd been declining for a while. I came out from Denver last fall to care for him. You came from Denver to this. Everett couldn't keep the surprise from his voice. Most folks go the other direction. Rebecca set a bowl before him along with fresh bread that must have been baked that morning. Denver didn't suit me anymore. Too many people, too much noise, too many expectations about what a woman should be and do. She settled across from him with her own bowl. Out here, I can just be myself. He understood that more than she knew. They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes, and Everett had to admit the stew was excellent, rich and flavorful, with potatoes and carrots and meat that had been properly seasoned. This is good, he said finally. Real good. Thank you. Cooking's one skill I actually enjoy. She broke off a piece of bread. Most of the domestic arts feel like prisons, but cooking feels creative, like painting or writing. You paint, some. Not well, but I enjoy it. She gestured to a small canvas on the far wall that he'd missed earlier. It showed the mountains at sunset, the peaks purple against an orange sky. That's my latest attempt. Everett stood to look at it more closely. The technique was amateur, but there was something in it, a feeling of vastness and beauty that captured what he loved about these mountains. It's good. You got the light right. You're being kind. I'm not. He returned to his seat, meeting her eyes. "I don't do kind for the sake of it, it's good. It makes me feel something, which means it's working." Rebecca's cheeks flushed pink and she looked down at her bowl. "That might be the best compliment anyone's ever given me about my painting." They finished the meal with easier conversation, Rebecca asking careful questions about mountain living, and Everett finding himself answering more fully than he had with anyone in years. She was intelligent and curious, asking about game movements and weather patterns and what plants were safe to eat, not the usual chatter about gossip and fashion that had driven him away from civilization. The sun was getting low when he finally stood to leave. "I need to make it back before full dark. I'll come by tomorrow, late morning probably, check on the Fawn. I'll be here." Rebecca walked him to the door. "Thank you again, Everett, truly." The sound of his name in her voice did strange things to his pulse. He nodded, settling his hat on his head. "Keep that bar across the door tonight. That mountain lion might come back looking for its kill." "I will. Be safe going home." He headed into the gathering twilight, acutely aware of her watching from the doorway until he disappeared into the trees. The walk back to his own cabin passed in a blur of thoughts he couldn't quite organize. He'd spent 8 years avoiding emotional entanglements, and now one afternoon with a stubborn woman and an injured fawn had cracked something open inside him. His cabin was dark and cold when he arrived, a stark contrast to Rebecca's warm, lived-in space. Everett built up the fire more from habit than cold August nights in the high country could be chilly, but tonight felt mild. He found himself restless, moving around the single room without purpose. Finally, he pulled out the battered journal he kept, more for practical notes than personal reflection. But tonight, he wrote about green eyes and auburn hair, and the feeling of working in tandem with someone who understood without needing words. He wrote until the fire burned low, then fell into his bunk with Rebecca's face the last thing in his mind. True to his word, Everett returned late the next morning, his saddlebags heavy with herbs and supplies. He'd spent an hour that morning gathering yarrow and calendula, plants he knew would help with healing. He'd also packed jerky and coffee, though he couldn't quite explain to himself why he felt the need to bring provisions. Rebecca met him at the door, her face lighting up in a way that made his chest tight. She'd changed into a clean blue dress, and her hair was freshly braided. "You came," she said, sounding genuinely pleased. "Said I would." He held up the saddlebags. "Got some things that'll help." "How's the patient?" "Restless, which seems like a good sign. It drank some water this morning, and I got it to take a little goat milk." They walked to the chicken coop together, and Everett was impressed by what she'd done. Fresh straw lined the floor, and she'd hung an old blanket to create a den-like space in the corner. The fawn lay in the makeshift den, its eyes brighter than yesterday, though it still looked weak. Everett knelt carefully, letting the animal catch his scent before touching it. The wounds looked clean, no sign of infection yet. "Good, real good. You did well." They spent the next hour tending to the fawn together. Everett showed Rebecca how to make a poultice from the herbs he'd brought, and they changed the bandages carefully. The work required them to move in close proximity, their hands brushing occasionally, and Everett found himself intensely aware of her nearness, the scent of lavender soap on her skin, the small sounds of concentration she made, the way her braid fell forward over her shoulder. "Have you named it?" he asked as they finished. "I was thinking Clover, since I found her near the clover patch by the creek." Rebecca stroked the fawn's head. "Is that silly?" "No sillier than naming a goat turnip." She laughed, and the sound made something warm unfurl in Everett's chest. They left Clover to rest and returned to the cabin, where Rebecca immediately put coffee on to boil. "Will you stay for lunch?" she asked. "I have cold chicken and fresh bread." Everett knew he should refuse. Every moment he spent here was another thread connecting him to this woman, another vulnerability he was creating. But he found himself nodding anyway. They ate on the porch, looking out over the meadow that stretched before the cabin. Wildflowers dotted the grass, lupine and paintbrush and columbine, and the mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still holding patches of last winter's snow. "It's beautiful here," Rebecca said softly. "I understand why you chose this life." "What about you?" Everett asked. "What made you really leave Denver? Can't just be the noise." She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns on the worn porch railing. "I was engaged," she said finally, "to a banker's son. Very respectable, very proper. He seemed kind at first, but the closer we got to the wedding, the more controlling he became. Who I could see, what I could read, how I should dress and speak and think." She paused. "When my grandfather got sick and I said I needed to come care for him, my fiancé forbade it. Said it wasn't appropriate for a woman of my station to go live in the wilderness like a savage. So you came anyway." "So I came anyway." She smiled, but there was sadness in it. "Broke off the engagement, scandalized my family, and took the stage west. My parents haven't written since I told them. I was staying after grandfather died." Everett felt a surge of anger at people he'd never met, at the banker's son who tried to cage her spirit, at the parents who'd abandoned her for choosing freedom. "Their loss," he said gruffly. "That's what I tell myself." She looked at him, and there was something searching in her gaze. "What about you? What brought you to the mountains?" He'd known the question would come eventually. "War," he said shortly. "Fought for the Union, saw things no man should see. When it ended, I couldn't go back to regular life. Everything seemed so small and pointless after watching good men die for inches of mud." He stared out at the mountains. "Came out here in '68, found work as a trapper and guide. Discovered I preferred being alone. Do you?" Rebecca asked quietly. "Prefer being alone?" The question hung between them, weighted with implications neither seemed ready to address directly. Everett turned to look at her, this woman who'd somehow slipped past his defenses in less than 2 days. "I used to think so," he said honestly. Her breath caught and color rose in her cheeks. Before either could say more, a sound from the tree line made Everett tense. He was on his feet in an instant, his hand dropping to the knife at his belt. "What is it?" Rebecca whispered, standing as well. "Something's out there." Moving through the brush. He stepped in front of her instinctively, his body between her and whatever threat approached. "Get inside, bar the door." "Not without you." "Rebecca, no." Her voice was firm. "I'm not leaving you out here alone if there's danger." Before he could argue further, the source of the noise emerged from the trees. Not the mountain lion he'd feared, but a young buck, its antlers still in velvet. The deer paused at the meadow's edge, staring at them with liquid eyes before bounding away across the grass. Everett released a breath he hadn't known he was holding. "False alarm. Your instincts are impressive, though." Rebecca's hand was pressed to her chest, her heart clearly racing. "You moved so fast." He realized he was still standing protectively in front of her, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her body behind him. Slowly he stepped aside, putting proper distance between them. "Old habits," he said gruffly. "War teaches you to react first, think second." They settled back onto the porch, but something had shifted in the air between them. An awareness, an acknowledgement of feelings neither seemed ready to name but couldn't ignore. Everett stayed until late afternoon, longer than he should have. They checked on Clover twice more, and Rebecca showed him her garden, pointing out the medicinal herbs she'd been growing at her grandfather's instruction. She was clearly knowledgeable about plants and their uses, another surprise in a woman full of them. "My grandmother was a healer," she explained as they walked between rows of lavender and chamomile. Taught my grandfather, and he taught me during my visits as a child. It's one reason I felt confident coming out here. I knew I could take care of myself if illness or injury struck. You learn to set bones, stitch wounds. Some. I'm not a trained physician, but I know the basics. More than most women back in Denver, which was another mark against me in polite society. She knelt to examine a drooping plant. Women aren't supposed to know about blood and anatomy. It's unseemly. It's practical, Everett corrected. Anyone living out here needs those skills. That's what I always thought. She looked up at him, shading her eyes against the sun. You're different from what I expected. What did you expect? I'm not sure. The stories about you in town make you sound like some kind of savage hermit who barely speaks and might shoot anyone who comes too close to his territory. Everett almost smiled. And I'm not. You're clearly educated. You speak well, think deeply. You're gentle with injured animals and patient when teaching. That's not a savage hermit. Maybe I'm just making an exception for you. The words came out lower, more intimate than he'd intended. Rebecca's eyes widened slightly, her lips parting, and for a moment Everett thought about what it would be like to kiss her to close the space between them and taste the surprise on her mouth. Instead, he stepped back, clearing his throat. I should head back. Check my trap lines before dark. Of course. Was that disappointment in her voice? Will you come again tomorrow? Clover should be checked on daily for at least a week. Make sure infection doesn't set in. So that's a yes. This time he did smile, quick and genuine. That's a yes. He returned the next day, and the next, and the next. A week passed, then two, and what had started as tending an injured fawn became something neither of them quite wanted to name, but both felt growing stronger with each shared moment. Clover improved steadily under their care. The wounds healed clean, and the fawn grew stronger, eventually able to stand and walk around the coop on wobbly legs. Rebecca was devoted to her patient, spending hours each day sitting with the fawn, talking softly and feeding her by hand. Everett found excuses to extend his visits. A loose board on the porch that needed fixing, firewood that needed splitting for winter, a section of fence that was sagging. Rebecca never questioned his offers of help, just accepted them with that soft smile that made his heart do strange things in his chest. They fell into routines that felt dangerously domestic. Coffee on the porch in the mornings while they discussed the day's tasks. Shared lunches where they talked about everything from books to philosophy to their dreams. Evenings where Everett taught Rebecca to shoot properly, standing behind her to adjust her grip on the rifle, his hands covering hers, both acutely aware of every point of contact. You're pulling the trigger, he murmured one evening, his breath warm against her ear. Don't pull, squeeze. Slow and steady. Rebecca adjusted and the rifle cracked. 50 yards away, the tin can she'd been aiming at flew off the fence post. I did it. She spun in his arms, her face alight with triumph, and suddenly they were inches apart, her smile fading as she realized their proximity. Everett should have stepped back, should have put proper distance between them. Instead, his hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing along her jaw. Rebecca, he said, her name a question and a prayer. Yes, she whispered, though he hadn't asked anything specific. He kissed her then, finally giving in to what he'd wanted for weeks. Her lips were soft under his, tentative at first, then warming as she kissed him back. His arms came around her waist, pulling her closer, and she melted against him with a small sound that made heat flood through his veins. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Everett rested his forehead against hers. I didn't plan that. I'm glad you didn't plan it. If you'd planned it, you might have talked yourself out of it. Her hands were fisted in his shirt, holding him close. I've wanted you to kiss me for 2 weeks. Only 2 weeks. He pulled back enough to look at her. I've wanted to kiss you since the second day when you laughed at Turnip trying to eat your laundry. Rebecca laughed, the sound bright and happy. That's very specific. I remember everything about you. The admission felt dangerous, like showing her a wound, but he couldn't seem to stop. The way you hum when you're working, how you take your coffee with honey instead of sugar, the face you make when you're concentrating on something difficult, all of it. Everett, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. I think I'm falling in love with you. The words should have terrified him. For 8 years he'd kept everyone at a distance, protecting himself from the possibility of loss. But looking at Rebecca, fierce and tender and brave enough to speak her heart, he felt only a fierce joy. I know I'm falling in love with you, he said. Probably already fallen if I'm honest. She kissed him again, softer this time, full of promise. When they parted, the sun was setting, painting the mountains gold and purple. Stay, Rebecca said quietly. Stay for dinner, stay for the evening, stay.